I hope that people can hear you because I cannot hear you.
Good. Well, welcome to the Roundtable Consult.
Now I hear you.
I was waiting for you to do the introduction, but you're welcome to. I mean, I always go first. Today, I figured I'd be a gentleman and let you go first. Would you
Oh,
like
you,
to?
yes, yes,
Would
you
you like to
always go
open us
first,
up?
and
Why don't you
and I
open us
figured
up?
you do that so that I could close it out, save the best for last.
Why,
But
why don't we
what were
get
you
you on?
rambling about
Why
before?
don't we get you on both ends? Welcome to the Roundtable Consult. I'm Dr. Mark Williams, and I'm joined by my wonderful cousin and co-host, Attorney Sonia Madison. Is what I said.
Okay. Got to check and make sure. You never know. With family, you never know. Could
We
be
never know.
could be a glowing endorsement or hate criticism.
And they both mean the same. Yes.
But I will say today so far has been good. My nephew called me this morning.
Mm.
I know. I was pleasantly surprised. I think he's on punishment, so he
Oh,
knows he can call me
yeah.
and not get in trouble.
You think
But
that what are you, the appellate court?
you said it, not me. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, but yeah, so it's good to catch up with him. And now I'm like, all right, let's talk about what we've been missing for the past 2 weeks. I mean,
Right.
it goes by so fast. I'm trying to remember
Yeah.
some
How
of
old
the
is your
stuff.
nephew, by the way? How old is he now?
He's 10.
10 years old. Oh,
Yes.
wow. 10
Now, I
years
mean,
old
I
in
do have
college.
multiple nephews, but the one
Well,
I'm
the one that's called, yeah.
yeah.
I know you got multiple. You got
I do have multiple.
a
No kids
whole,
of my own, but multiple nieces and
you
nephews. So.
multiple. You have almost as many of them as I do, as a matter of fact.
But who's counting? No, no.
Yes, apparently
No
you are.
message sent to my siblings to continue to beat him out.
Or stop. Or stop. Either way. Don't continue. Don't necessarily stop. No messages at all.
How about you? Has it been raining over there in Nashville?
I don't know. I was in San Diego last week and it was
That's
beautiful.
right. That's
It
right.
was
Oh,
beautiful. So this past week, no, it hasn't been. We've been it's been a little actually it's been pretty nice this week. I wish I could have enjoyed it a little bit better. Seem to come down with this cold or this little cough, and it's this time of the year, it's that time of the year, the most wonderful time of the year. You start to hear me cough again. So get ready for it. I'll try to mute every time I do today if I do.
Well, I know one thing that we have missed out is all the updates on Trump. Now, just so we know, as it relates to the New York civil trial, again, he's been found guilty of, or liable, I should say, not guilty, but liable for fraud. It's just a matter of what the sentencing is going to be. And so I've heard, because I haven't been following, but I've heard he continues to cause disruption to the judge and on his social media activities. So, I mean, hopefully that judge will then say, hey, we're going to make sure you don't have any more Trump towers in New York, or we're going to make sure you have to pay a lot. I'm hoping that will go against him in terms of the consequences.
Now that is an interesting point. Now the question is, for most of us who are not that savvy with the legal system, the judge had already did a summary judgment saying that we found that he is liable for fraudulently reporting his business data or whatever. Why are they going through trials right now?
Yeah, so again, it is about what is the consequences? How much has he actually defrauded people? And so we can determine how much he has to pay, as well as I think part of the consequences is you can't do business here. You're going to have to remove from some of your name from some of the buildings that you have. And so, I mean, to lose the ability to do business in New York would hit him fairly hard. And also, of course, we know that he owes money to people, so I don't know if that matters for him, but that in and of itself is partly why, again, as we go into election cycle, people have to keep in mind he is trying to avoid having to pay, as well as having to endure with some of the consequences. And so to think that he's really just out here for the people is to ignore the fact that he's got a stake in this game. He's not someone who has a lot of money, not looking for a way out of it.
So the judge this week has come under a lot of criticism, or at least over the past 2 weeks since we last visited, has come under a lot of criticism because when Trump himself took the stand, he rambled on and on and on and wouldn't answer all the questions and would dance around the answers, basically just do how Trump does with in the midst of his senility. but by not answering the question, the judge was like, "Well, I don't want to hear all of that. I'm asking. I want you to stick to and answer the questions."
Did
And
you overvalue Mar-a-Lago? I mean, as the yes or no.
so it got quite hostile sometimes in the courtroom while he was on the stand. And I guess when they broke for lunch and they came back, the judge finally said, "Listen, I tell you what, this is going to be on the prosecutor. If you want him to go ahead and ramble on, if that's helpful for you at some point, I'll let you go ahead and do that." But the reality of it was just that Trump was using the bench as a campaign stoop. It was not necessarily anything in his particular defense, and I would imagine that judges have quite a bit of leeway about what they can and cannot. I mean, what they will allow and should or allow during these types of hearings. Again, he's already been found guilty or at least liable for this by summary judgment. So I'm not sure why they need to hear his testimony in the first place. But is this equivalent of a sentencing trial or something, or what?
Well, first of
Or
all,
criminal?
I would imagine if it was anyone else, we probably wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's Trump and because has such a national platform, and he probably would be the one that requested to make sure that he takes the stand so that he can ramble on. And just as an example for our listeners, I recall one question that Letitia James asked him was about his whereabouts and what he was doing in 2021. And he goes on to his whole, well, we're talking to Russia. I was doing this. He was like, no, you were not the president. So in 2021. So let's stick to what were you doing in 2021. So again, that's just one example of how he takes a question to steer it towards an attempt to use it as a means for campaigning. But again, I just said, this is all he's getting a lot of privilege. He's getting a lot of leeway because again, if this was anyone else, I don't think we'd be going through nearly as much. I'm sure they probably would have determined the fine and determined the consequences and moved on. But because it's Trump and because we want to make sure people see that, hey, he was treated based on the evidence and the facts and the law in this case, because we know you're going to go campaign and talk about how, oh, it's a fraud, it's Democrats out to get me and blah, blah, blah. We will, and even the judge, I mean, because I'd imagine he's getting death threats. I know Letitia James is getting death threats. I'd imagine even with that, it's like, hey, I just want to make sure it's clear. I am doing what's in accordance with the law. It's open. It's all transparent. You see it. As well as I'm trying to attempt to protect my family and friends who are being accosted and threatened by what's going on.
It'll all come back up on the appeals anyway. So yeah, I guess he needs to make sure that he's dotting his I's and crossing his T's.
It will, as well as this, it will hold because again, he has to answer to Georgia. I mean, he has other places that he still has to answer to during this entire situation or ordeal. And we know that Ivanka Trump tried to get out of testifying with her attempt of saying
the whole family testified. Yeah, basically. It'd be interesting to see where that goes. I came across another interesting story. There's this guy named Douglas Mackey. I don't know if you've heard about him or not, but he was obviously Trump. Well, not obviously, but he was a huge Trump supporter. And during the 2016 campaign, he had amassed a lot of Twitter followers, and those, I think they ranked him as like the 107th social media influencer for the campaign in the cities. I mean, in the country. So he actually he was pretty influential. And I saw an interview with Tucker Carlson and this guy after he was found guilty of conspiracy to deprive others of their voting rights. What happened was he wound up creating these memes, these little ads. They looked like they were ads. They looked like they were legitimate ads. And they said, stay home, skip the line, vote, text for Hillary vote by text. And so he was promoting these things. And so he got arrested for conspiracy to deprive people of their rights and was found guilty in March of this year. And so Tucker Carlson must have interviewed him and kept saying things of the nature that our free speech is in danger now because now you can get arrested for just simply making fun of Hillary Clinton, and this is a dangerous, slippery slope that we're going down. And I'm sort of thinking like, he didn't get arrested or indicted or convicted for making fun of Hillary Clinton. He got indicted for conspiracy by a jury of 12 of his peers for conspiracy, meaning a plan to defraud people of their votes, and he ignored all the other evidence that was out there that where the guy tweeted certain things. We have to find a way to limit minority votes, legitimate tweets that he's putting out to his follower. We have to find a way to minimize the black vote, to limit it as much as possible. And then all of a sudden these other tweets come that use the official text, the fonts and everything of the Hillary Clinton campaign, at the end paid for and endorsed by the Hillary Clinton campaign. And he says that it was just supposed to be a joke. But never mind the other communications he had within this other quiet chat room where people had conspired to do it. And I was just listening to Tucker so disingenuously try to paint this as something that it wasn't. And the most irony, this is the part that I really liked about it. He said, for any political candidate to celebrate or advocate for her critics to be locked up, he was like, that's by definition. He's like, we're in the territory of Idi Amin, right? And I'm sitting thinking, like, have you forgotten about the whole lock her up Trump campaign? Lock them up, because it was no longer her anymore. He moved over to the lock them up. And every person who's a Democrat, he said, lock them up. And I was like, now, you want to talk about out of his own mouth, I guess he admitted what the dictatorial conspiracy was. So I don't know why I brought that up, but it was just interesting.
Because speaking on that, what are you thinking about Joe Manchin? And I imagine he'll probably get Mitt Romney and some other people trying to form a third party, because he's announced that he will not be running for re-election to the Senate, but he's still touring around, going around, going to Israel, going to various spots. I mean, still it's like he's on a campaign for something. And a lot of people are assuming that it's the presidency. But we know that he would not win a Democratic nomination. We know that he's not in the Republican Party. So it seems to be like he's toting around this potential opportunity to start a third party, and that is more of a middle. What are you thinking?
I think there's never been a time more right for it than right now.
Not this election, though.
I mean, then which one? I mean, because at this point, we've got two extremes who you have to be extreme in order to win the primary vote.
You think Joe Biden is extreme?
Well, he's the incumbent, so they're pretty much going to give him the... And people argue that he shouldn't be that, because obviously in the polls, he's losing to Donald Trump. And some generic unnamed Democratic candidate apparently performs better against Trump than he does. So,
well, they say Nikki Haley may perform better at Biden than Trump. But one thing about the polls is, I think right now we're in a Republican Party election cycle, and so I think it's hard to really determine if whether people are actually actively doing the polls right now, but also if those polls are a representation of what the general election will look like. I was reading somewhere where they said the past several incumbents, when you poll them the year before the election, their poll numbers aren't looking well. But again, when you're constantly getting Republican talking points because they're going through their primary, then the Democrats are clearly not actively trying to campaign as much as the Republican Party are. So I don't look too much into polls right now. But that is, hopefully that will give the Democrats a heads up to say, hey, when it's time, you got to start coming strong. You got to remind people what Joe Biden has done. You got to remind people what the issues are. This past election for the locals have been telling, because Democrats won big in Virginia and Texas and in some of the big states. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, it's because of abortion. A lot of people push on abortion. But also, at least this is my optimism, I'm also hoping it's a lot of people are fighting against the extremes. You had a whole January 6th election fraud happening. I think people are hopefully fighting against that.
But they're extremes on both sides. This is which reason why I'm saying there's probably never a more right time for a third party. Because we got 70% of the country saying, we don't want to see Trump, and 70% saying we don't want Biden. And those are going to be the two candidates. It seems like just screaming for a third person to come in and for a little bit of moderation to prevail. So
yeah, well, I don't consider Joe Biden extreme, but that's why I'm saying I'm not looking into what the polls are saying right now. But my caution is to putting a third party now would to me mean those votes are going to be going for Trump, and and having Trump in the White House. I mean, come on, is that not the terror? Just the thought of it? This is not
I don't, I
a
don't,
sense of fear.
I don't believe that very many Democrats will vote for Joe Manchin. Well, I just don't think he's engendered a lot of favor within
But
the
he would run
Democratic
for a
Party.
third party ticket, so it wouldn't be like he'd be trying to get the Democratic nomination.
So what he would probably be getting is the Never Trumpers. I mean, he would put a big dent, I think, in the Never Trumpers. They'd be like, we kind of like Joe Manchin. He's always really been an undercover Republican anyway. And so I think that's where that would go. But,
Biden needs those Never Trumpers.
Truth of the matter is it probably doesn't really matter who becomes in that office because, the continuum is going to be the continuum. It's going where it is. And that's why I think in this country, we need to devote ourselves more to prayer and to Thanksgiving anyhow, for these upcoming elections, not just these upcoming elections, but also for everything that we see going on around in the world today. It's a lot of people are hurting, it's not just people and on the streets who are homeless or anything, but you see a wide range of just hurt. I mean, some of it on a whole national scale, as we see in Gaza, and Ukraine, and then I guess was the Darfur or something like that. I think there was some other stuff going on around that area. It's ethnic cleansing going on, I think, in Darfur. The world is really getting to a point where there's a great level of instability, and I think that's a natural progression of our fate as humans. Is that I always go through with this thought of entropy. Entropy in chemistry says that atoms favor a state of disorder. And in order for them two atoms to remain in close contact with each other, they require energy. And since atoms is a basic unit of all matter, including humans, then I think we at our very core favor a state of disorder. I posted something earlier this week which said, in order for civilization to survive or to persist, it requires for mankind to be willing to and able to and commit to denying themselves and self-constraint. And it's not in our nature to just naturally constrain ourselves. But if we can do it for a greater good, then we can bring order to places. But when we just get to the place where we're like, we don't have to constrain ourselves, I don't have to deny myself, then we're progressing toward a state of chaos and disorder, that entropy that I was referring to. And so now I think is a good time for prayer.
Well, and I do want to define it because I feel like oftentimes, and to your point, yes, we've got a lot of international tragedies as well as even national. We've had a couple of gun violence incidents. And of course, when that happens, the conversation turns into, okay, what are we going to do about guns? And we've got Republicans saying, we just need to pray that things will get better. And we've got Democrats saying, no, we need to make it more strict, and independent on if you think both are extremes or another. It's a debate for another day. But when you say, well, let's pray and that it goes better, well, first of all, let's define prayer. Because if that is just simply a communication with God, God is answering, either saying you to do something or saying you to not do something or to be patient or whatever, but it's still a form of communication. And I'd imagine to some degree, whether or not you recognize what God is saying in response will depend on your level of study and being able to discern between what is your voice versus what is God's voice. And that in and of itself, back to that denying yourself that you need to do, you have to deny your voice in order to understand what his voice is asking of you in this moment of prayer. But I feel like people like to use prayer as a tool to bring out a piece on the discussion, or to halt the discussion. I don't want to say peace, but to halt, or to stop someone from actually understanding, taking in what it is that they're feeling, or the chaos, instead of a tool for, hey, we need action. Let us communicate with God to determine what that action looks like.
Well, I think the Bible really does distinguish between, I don't know if it necessarily distinguishes, but I think Philippians 4 is what it's talking about. Excuse me.
About
It
that
says,
season, dear.
yeah, that season. It's that time of the year. Y'all pray for me. uh, but Philippians 4 was like, be anxious for nothing, but in all things, by prayer and supplication, and with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And it goes on and says, the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds and through Christ. And so when we start talking about prayer, I think we have to, as you said, it's just a communication with God. And that's true. Sometimes that communication with God may not necessarily always be coupled to a request. And there enters supplication. A supplication is really a reverent request made unto God, for God to do something. And so I think we do need to distinguish, are we just talking to God just for the purpose of talking? Because I don't think that always God is going to answer. In fact, frankly, there have been a lot of times when I prayed and God hasn't answered. I listened to Bill Maher last night. He came on his show last night. He was like, had Ted Cruz on. He was talking about, he said, you guys, when you prayer, he said, prayer is one thing, but when you talk to God, but when you hear back from him, he's like, that's not God, that's just a thought. And then it wound up going to break. And so I guess Ted Cruz didn't have a chance to reply on that one. But, maybe it isn't always that God responds back. And when God does respond back, is it just a thought, or how do you even know that he's actually really communicating with you?
Well, and that's why I say you got to discern your voice from God's voice. And to do that, you do need to be in study so that you understand or recognize what God is, and what his voice, or what he would say, and make sure is conducive with your study, versus if it's just your voice. And so back to what you said, you got to deny yourself so that you can better recognize the other person. And to me, it's no different than in your relationship. I'd imagine there are points where Doris probably thinks, I know exactly what Mark would say if I asked him this, or if I want to go in this direction. I know Mark well enough to know exactly where he was staying with that. And so I do think it takes that constant, back and forth study, relationship or whatnot. I still, even when people say he didn't answer, I mean, sometimes a lack of an answer is still an answer. And you have to, again, based on your own study, determine what even that lack of an answer means. It could mean that, hey, not right now, I hear you, but right now I've got you in this present situation that I just want you to focus on. Or he may be saying no. And you may continue to ask him, you've got Paul as an example. He begged them, please take this thorn out. And eventually had to accept the answer is no. And even in that, Paul recognized, well, it's not no because you asked and I don't want to do it, but it's a no because I'm using that to ensure people see me in all that you do. And so, I mean, I encourage people to, even when they feel like God isn't answering, perhaps that is an answer. And you need to take that as, hey, he's either telling me not to do anything right now, but he's giving me so many other blessings that he needs me to give back to him to focus on. Or again, you continue to ask in hopes that, I guess, at some point, maybe he will change his answer.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you may not even ask. In that example that you gave with Doris said, well, I know how Mark would typically respond to it. In many of those cases, she might be like, I'm not going to ask him then. Sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. But that's the point. The point that I'm making is sometimes we don't really ask God for the things that we want, because a lot of times we're recentered. We're so focused on what we want. And without that denialism, without us denying ourselves, can we really then offer a prayer that's moving to God and one that God would answer? Maybe sometimes God is not answering because you're asking amiss. He said, Jesus he told his disciples, he said, you have not because you ask not. And when you ask amiss. You ask with the wrong intent. You ask with the wrong purpose or the motive, because I'm convinced that a lot of times that's because we're asking God, don't let your will be done, let my will be done. In this case, we had a guest a viewer who commented, he said, prayer is the realignment of the center heart of who I am to the center of to the center, meaning the heart of who God is. And so when we pray, it's our opportunity to align not God's will with our will, and if I'm understanding them correctly, but it's an opportunity for us to be able to say, God, I want to align my heart with what your will and what your purpose was. Even Jesus, when he prayed, Jesus was like, listen, I got something going on here that I don't want to happen. Like, but if it's possible, let this thing not happen to me, God. Father, dear beloved Father of mine,
The Almighty,
Almighty, my A1 from day one,
Right.
It's like, if it's at all possible, let this
There's
thing.
a door in which you can get your will without me going through it this way.
And I get it, trust me, because we're always, every time we come to God, what we're asking for God to do is to really fulfill our will, what we want. We're making a supplication. Now, when our will becomes to see his will fulfilled, then I believe God is going to answer immediately. He's like, yeah, of course I'm going to do this. Why? Because you asked the right way. You're not asking amiss. I think it was Solomon who, when God said, ask me for anything that you want. And Solomon said, I want to know how to rule your people with wisdom, wisely. And God was like, oh my God, that's my boy right there. Now your center is aligned with my center. Now we can accomplish something. And so God says, okay, I'm going to give you what you asked for, but I'm going to give you more than what you asked for because you found the key. The key is aligning your will with mine and not trying to fit mine into your will.
I mean, no, I agree. And so in doing that, again, when we're applying prayer to our application, again, I'm going to go with these examples, and I hate that it's a lot of evangelicals, it's the conservatives, the Republican Party, like, quit using prayer as a means to stop the conversation. Because again, if we're dealing with an issue or concerns or conflicts, I do believe that God wants us to be at peace in the situation that he's in. You've got to, of course, be at peace and him handling it, not in the way you want to handle it. But has to be an understanding and acknowledgement that something has to be handled. We're not gonna, just sit here and hope that people change their own hearts. But also going into the Thanksgiving, because when we look at or analyze the Lord's Prayer, I want to say that the first part, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, is an acknowledgement of who he is. And often, and I know you gave that example of even when Jesus was in Gethsemane saying, hey, God, I mean, yeah, I don't want to do this, but hey, I want your will to be done. So if that's the way we got to do it, that's what happens. But even in that, there's the first thing is the acknowledgement of, hey, you are who you are. And it is you that has created everything. It is you that knows exactly how to turn this around. And it's only through you that, however this should look. And we, of course, often want to play God because we want to have the control and the ability to determine how things should look. And even when we're talking about family, you get a lot of I only use men because they're the leaders of the household, but men saying, hey, just follow me.
I love to hear you say that too, by the way. So
yeah, they are.
you can say that again one more time. I'm liking this transformation God is placing in you.
But to me, being the leader of a household, that is no easy feat.
No.
And that's the thing that concerns me a lot of times with men, is that you want that position, but you don't do the study, or you don't make sure you have the tools to do it. It's kind of going back to your Solomon analogy. Solomon recognized, hey, I am young. My father was doing his own thing. I wasn't quite an apprentice or walking hand in hand and making sure I understood how to do this. I need help. I don't know what I'm doing. And so the fact that he asked for wisdom indicates that, hey, I need tools to be able to run this nation of people that you have called me to do. I would want men who are wanting to be husbands and fathers to have that same request. Hey, I need the tools. And if that means leaning on your spouse as your helpmate, then lean on your spouse as your helpmate. Or if that means, hey, again, you have to deny yourself of wanting to just go out and bring in money without having more of a physical or more of a presence in the household, then again, you've got to deny what that looks like to you to make sure it conforms what God is saying this should look like.
And so that happens on both sides. So because a husband, using your example, because a husband's actions and responses don't conform to the ideals that you think should align with what God is saying, doesn't necessarily mean that God isn't directing and leading him. There's one of the viewers says, show us where you are working so we can join you, Lord, was one of the things that she was saying. And I think what happens is that we think a lot of times, if it doesn't measure up to what we deem as a laudable cause or a laudable pathway or strategy, that, it must not be from God. I'm looking at even the war in Gaza, for example, and I walk lightly when I say this, because there are some things that when we look at it, we say God can't be pleased with that, or God can't have ordained that. How do you know God that didn't decide to wipe out an entire nation of people? How do we know? And I heard Benjamin Netanyahu recently refer to the Amalekites, and this has been the example that I've been using a while. I said, if a prophet today told a leader of a nation to go and wipe out all the children, all the women, all the people, all the inhabitants, including the cattle and everything else, we would look at that and we call it terrorism. Why? Because it doesn't comport with what our human ideologies are. And I'm glad that we are humanitarian and that we have humanity. But the reality of it is the root of that is humanness. And so we interpret a lot of things based off of our humanness, which is temporary by nature, as opposed to interpreting it from an eternal perspective, which means that we really just don't know what the end of that's going to be, because we weren't there at the beginning, and we won't be there at the end. Chances are, and so we don't know what happens in between. But God has that eternal perspective, so He can say, "Okay, well, I need this to happen this way, because if it doesn't happen this way, I know 300 years from now what's going to wind up happening. So I need him to go in and kill all the Amalekites. I need him to go in and wipe out all of those Hamas sympathizers." And I'm not advocating for this, because my heart goes out to the civilians as well. I'm very much compassionate for every person who is suffering, but more than being compelled by my compassion for their suffering, my compulsion now has to be focused on saying, God, may they find you before it's too late. Whether they suffer a horrific death or not, some of us as Christians, we're going to suffer horrific deaths. I'm not going to pray, God, stop that from happening, unless I qualify and said, if it be your will, but nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. I'm not going to say that. But we do it. A lot of times we qualify our prayers, and we will only ask the prayer for the one that we need because it comports with what our humanity tells us is right. And our humanity sometimes tells us something that is contrary to God's deity.
Now, I do think the Bible makes it clear that we do need to recognize who false teachers are. Because again, if someone is asking you, whether that's the pastor or whether that's the leader, we know how cults get started and what is asking you to do something, and in your heart you believe that's not aligned with God's will, that you should challenge. And I'm saying, look at the Bible, because again, I know we often can look at Old Testament and see how he obliterated several cities, but when we go to New Testament, I mean, the idea was, oh, he's going to obliterate, and so that the Jewish people can have Israel and everything back, and that's not what Jesus came to do. And so from my perspective, it's okay if someone is asking you, yeah, to go kill a certain group of people. I don't care if it's the Hamas or whatever. Um, for you to say, hey, let me pray about this. Let me make sure that this is what God is calling me to do. I mean, you think about Paul, if he had stopped and prayed, and he probably say I probably did, and God told me to still kill the Christians. That's what he felt. That's what he felt. I mean, that's one person that God did recognize. Man, that person holds on to their principle and their conviction and will go with it. And he was able to use Paul because he was someone that held so close and tight to their conviction. But the point is, he still came to Paul. And so I do think that God will come and say, hey, this is what I'm asking you to do, or this is not what I'm asking you to do. And if you, in your heart, you're even not getting an answer, I wouldn't say that lack of answer means you go follow this teacher blindly. You can look at and be able to hear what someone is saying and to measure that with your own study and understanding of God to see if that lines up.
So now we depend. Excuse me. Now we depend on the heart and what our heart discerns. But the Bible tells us that the heart is deceitful above. Excuse me.
Is God trying to tell you? I want you to think about this a little bit before you.
Well, the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can know what the Bible tells us? And it's difficult for us to even know our own hearts. I remember early on when I first started leading worship, I was very nervous about leading worship. And but I was appointed in that position. There was another guy who was very comfortable doing it. And so I was going to let him, I said, okay, I'll let him lead worship. He said, are you going to? God was warning me. He was like, don't be so intimidated by doing it so that you shirk off your responsibilities. I said, okay, well, fine. So he said, who's going to lead worship this Sunday? I said, I will. And he said, why? Because I don't want to shirk off my responsibilities because of my insecurity and everything else. And like, it's fine. Who's going to lead worship the next week? And no, I did it backwards. I said the first time I did, in any case, I can't remember exactly off the cuff, but the bottom line was, he said, when is he going to lead worship? And I said, well, he can lead worship here or there. And he's like, well, good. Just make sure that the reason he's not leading worship is because you want to protect your position. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, what are you talking about? I said, why would I even do that? But God knows me. And he says, wait a minute, I know how you can get in your heart and how jealousy or envy can rise up within you. And I'm like, God, that's not part of who I am. But God was like, listen, your heart can deceive you. It can easily become part of you. And even though it may not manifest right now, he's like, I see further down the road how this thing can easily manifest in your life if I don't identify it for you. And if you're not cautious to be able to observe for when it's coming up, because if you're not cautiously observing for its manifestation, then you'll miss it and you'll be operating in it based off of what's natural to you. And so I was like, oh, wow, I need to pay attention to that. And I need to always walk circumspectly and always not inspecting everybody else around me, but also inspecting myself to make sure that my motives are pure. And I will tell you that sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not your motives are exactly pure and or whether they're God inspired or whether they're selfishly inspired, because I learned a lot of things. There's a lot of times that my voice sounds a lot like God's to me.
That might be the first sign that you might want to humble yourself a little more.
No, and I'm not saying that I sound like a deity, but what I'm saying is that, I can easily say this is something that I personally want, and I can say, well, God, this is what God wants for me. And I disguise it and say that this is what God's plan is for me. No, that's what your plan is for you. And if you're not critically and honestly interrogating your motives, then you miss it. I wake up in the morning, I say, God, this today, guard my mind, my mouth, and my motives, because all three of those things can get us in trouble. And a lot of times we don't even, and the motives is the one that's most elusive to us, because we don't really know what our motives sometimes are in doing certain actions. And unless God reveals it to us by his spirit, we'll always remain oblivious to it.
I mean, I do agree that if you aren't intentional about going to God with your decisions, then you don't recognize how much of the decisions you made are based on what you want to do versus, again, being intentional about asking God, hey, is this what you're asking me to do? And when you are intentional and you're practicing that, because that's what faith often is, it's a practice. You do have to practice it and grow or not. But the more you practice, hopefully the idea is the more your thoughts do start to conform to what it is that God is asking of us as holy people or as his holy people. But again, it takes a practice. And as you go through different phases in your life, you fall down and you recognize, hey, I got to keep getting back up. And so with that, I definitely agree that you can't, even though I laugh because I know that you probably do think that you and God are I and I, but but I do agree that if you are practicing, going to God and being in study, and a lot of stuff that you're doing is aligned with how you understand God and how your study is revealing itself. I mean, first of all, it's hard. It is hard to do that. But the more you do it, the more natural it starts to become. I do agree. But I just don't think that, at least maybe this is just me projecting, but I just don't think
Probably
that
is.
when we're kids, we really are just following our parents' instruction. And hopefully the idea is for, as a parent, you teach your child how to grow in Christ, and you teach your child about prayer, you teach your child about Thanksgiving. But the reality is, oftentimes, if the child is doing it, they're probably doing it because you told them that they need to do it. And so it's again an alignment with the obedience of the parent. And so when you get to then adulting and you're on your own, if you still have your parents, you're probably still leaning on that. But as your parents start going away, again, you have to re-practice. Okay, am I going to just do it by myself based on what I think, my parents have shown me growing up? Because we often will do what we see, versus what we don't see. Or, okay, am I going to start this practice of going and study, praying, talking to God, making sure that, again, these decisions that I'm making, I am doing in meditation and consultation with God.
So a viewer makes a comment is that people say God said a lot because, number one, they know nobody's going to really challenge that, and number two is a form of manipulation. They use it as a form of manipulation. The reality is that, you know, if somebody say God said it, how many of us are actually going to say no, he didn't? I was leading worship at one church before, and one member came to the pastor and said, God told me don't tithe for a period of time, and so that I can get all my debts paid off and everything. And the pastor was adamant about, he's like, God would never say that. And I was like, I don't know. I can't say what God would do and what God wouldn't do. It doesn't comport with my paradigms and my understanding of what God would do and what God would say. But I would never expect God to say, Abraham, go sacrifice your child unto me. And so I don't know. I can't put my mouth to and say that God would never say that. Um,
But
and
you can get to, I guess, to some degree, you can understand God saying, sacrifice your child to me, because he's asking all of us to do, all of us have kids, and that will be excluding me,
well,
but
the
to
sacrifice
sacrifice
versus
your child
kill.
to
How
me.
about kill your child, basically?
Yeah, but you can, but again, once we see the story in hindsight, you can see it makes sense that God would test Abraham's faith.
But
And
you
so
only get
that,
that in
will it
hindsight, though,
then
right?
surprise you that if God asks you to do the same thing, like, hey, he's going to test your faith too?
Yeah, but we only get that benefit in
In
hindsight.
hindsight,
But
yeah,
but when
I
somebody's
agree.
telling it to you in real time, you start saying, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe God didn't say that. Maybe this guy is going off. He's flown the cuckoo's nest," and that's how we get all of these cults where people wind up killing themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's a slippery slope there because it's so hard to know and know where you go, where what God really is saying at that point. And I think that's why Jesus reminded us. He said, be careful, because there are people who are coming to deceive you. And if it were possible, he would even deceive the elect of God. And that's why I really caution us that, I hear you, be compassionate. We should be compassionate in everything we should do. But our compassion for humanity should never really cloud our perspective and obedience to God. I what I mean by that is that I get into it a lot with evangelicals just because they really believe that we should be praying to avoid persecution, and we should be doing everything that we can do to prevent persecution. And that's contrary to the will of God, I think.
I
My
agree.
interpretation of what the word of God says
I agree.
is that you will be persecuted for my name's sake.
Blessed are the persecuted, right?
Yeah, you're supposed to be blessed when you are. So you're praying against your blessing, right? You're praying, but it makes good human sense to say, why should we not, in America, why should we not be able to exercise our rights to free speech and our freedom of and from religion? We should be able to do that. Well, you're taking a human perspective and a human right that you have been granted, and I thank God for that. That right that we have been granted, we're taking that and trying to now ascribe it to a godly precept, and that's not the case. We should be saying, hey, I get challenged sometimes when people say, hey, pray for my mother's or my brother's health. You know, they're in the hospital right now, they could possibly die, and I'm going to pray for them. But my prayer, and goes even for my own illnesses, I'm saying, okay, God, I'm going to pray. This is what my will is, but I'm going to finish it up to say, but nevertheless, God, your will be done. If it is your will for my life to end at this moment and end in this way, then so be it. I'm not going to try to say, God, keep me alive for another 5 years so that I can see this. That's selfish. It really is. But it's human. And that's what our humanity wants to do. Our humanity wants to say, God, stop all young children from being abducted and sold into sex slavery. Absolutely, that's something that we should be praying for. But the reality of it is that the plan of God requires that humanity devolves so tremendously that type of behavior becomes commonplace. And we're just not ready and prepared to see those kinds of things because it hurts our humanity. And when we start seeing atrocities that hurt our humanity, we have to become guarded that we don't lose our salvation pursuing our humanitarian causes, because that's how the elect will be deceived and they will be sold over into the words of false prophets, because they're finding ways to try to save their own lives. Jesus said, if you try to save your own life, he who tries to save his life will lose it, but he who will lose it for my sake will gain eternal life. And I think that's the snare, that's the trick of the enemy, is to think that we're supposed to be praying for this world to be a better place. No, it's not going to be a better place. We're supposed to be praying that when it does dissolve, when we see the time of desolation comes, God, let us be prepared to still stand on your word. Let us be prepared to still profess your kingdom, so that when our time comes, we can spend an eternity with you. And he said it's going to get so bad that even if he didn't shorten the days of it, nobody would survive. Think about that. How bad does it have to be such that if he didn't shorten the number of days, none of us would still maintain our salvation? That's got to be pretty bad. And so while we're praying to God to make this world a better place, it's a good prayer. It's a nice prayer, but I think it's a prayer that's gone amiss.
Well, and I often, when I've done some Bible studies that I've led, one of the topics has been evaluating your prayer, because again, if you're asking God, oh, please let me make 6 figures by the end of the year,
Hey,
or if you're asking God, please let me be married in 6 months,
you prayed that,
and it doesn't happen, you're saying, oh, why? God doesn't care. I mean, Job to me is a perfect example. I mean, once he gets all this wealth, whether it's spiritually or earthly, he gets a lot of possessions, but then once it's taken away, as the devil is removing each one, he sees that as, wait a minute, is God abandoning me? Or wait a minute, did I do something? And even his friends are coming like, well, did you pray right? Have you been a faithful servant? Have you asked God, hey, I'm drowning, please help me. But again, if your prayer is, oh, help me get out of this ailment, and you maintain yourself in that ailment, examine, hey, what is it that you're really asking? Because if you, and I hate to then bring out the whole legal attorney hat rule, but if you see it as, hey, so long as I ask God, he will give me what I want, and that's what the whole desires of my heart means, then if maybe he's trying to teach you, no, that's not that's not the promise that I gave you. And so in that, and you're essentially asking yourself, well, then what is the promise? Why am I here? And when you find yourself there, then it's going back to that foundation of, no, you're here. And you can even look at what the devil said. You're here because God wants people to worship him. And the devil is challenging God. Like, the only reason Job is worshiping you is because you've made his life great. You take away that stuff and he's not going to worship you anymore. And so it is important that you look at those prayers and see, hey, what is my prayer? Am I asking something that God has promised me? Or am I, again, more so into my selfish personal desires? I want this, and God should give it to me by virtue of the fact that I have accepted him as my savior. But I would also say, if someone is telling you, God told you or told me that you need to follow me, or God told me that you're going to be my spouse, or God told me that you need to join the forces and let's go kill Hamas. Again, you can, or even what the guy said with your church, God told me not to tithe. To me, I'm not going to argue what God told you. But if you're telling me for me to do something, I'm going to say, well, I need to talk to God. Because I don't know if that is your personal thing or not, but I have my own relationship with God. And if God is saying, hey, you're going to be my spouse, or if God is saying, hey, you need to stop tithing, or if God is saying, hey, you need to join the military so we can go fight Hamas, he's going to tell me. We're going to have this conversation. He's going to tell me. And that's the purpose of making sure we discern false teachers, because you don't want someone else trying to tell you what God is asking of you. That was the whole reason why Jesus came, so that we can have our own direct access to God, and we're not having to go through priests, or not having to go through even men, because, hey, that us as women, I'm sure we were doing that too, to have our own relationship.
I think one thing that you touched on when you talked about Job was Job recognized that regardless of what the answer was, that he still needed to give thanks in the middle of that. Job said, naked came I into this world, naked will I return. He said, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And then he followed that up. He said, blessed be the name of the Lord. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Okay. My screen just went off crazy somehow. But the point is that a lot of times we give thanks regardless of what the answer is, because, or if there is no answer. I think First Thessalonians somewhere in there, it says, in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God concerning you in Christ Jesus. And so that's a hard one for us to be able to do. When we're suffering, we're supposed to even give thanks in the middle of that, because yeah, I'm trusting that this is the will of God, that this suffering that I'm going through, this cough that I'm dealing with right now, this headache that I'm getting from coughing is not God's perfect will for me, but it's the steps, it's the plan that God had for me to be able to walk through in order to find my place in him. And I don't necessarily say that God intends for us to endure, or wants us to endure atrocities. By the mere fact that we live in a fallen world, we're going to endure the atrocities. But God's will is that we still serve him and we still overcome the world through our faith. Jesus said, in this world you will have troubles.
So now you froze. Okay, I think you're back now. In this world,
froze,
you will have
I froze
troubles.
again. Yes. In this world, you will have troubles. And that's what he told us. You're going to have those troubles. He said, but take heart, because I have overcome them all. So I don't believe that it's the will of God that you that you have troubles. I think it's the will of God that you overcome those troubles that are necessary and that will necessarily come by nature of us living in a sinful world. And one of my favorite scriptures talks about it says, "For I reckon that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed." The suffering is going to come. And the only way that we get to the glory is if we endure the suffering. And I think that's what God is expecting us to do. And that's the will of God. The will of God is not for us to have the troubles, but his will is for us to overcome the troubles, not to evade the troubles, but to overcome them.
No, and I agree. And to overcome them, we have to follow him. And in doing that, we also have to recognize when we aren't following him, we're adding on to the problems and the suffering, because to then get out of it is we're going to have to, again, have God correct what it is that we have messed up. And endure, even in that correction, that's going to require some suffering. I mean, when you look at, unfortunately, families is something that's just come around a lot. I don't know if it's because the holidays are coming up, but when you look at a lot of blended families, I'd imagine the transition to blend, that is tough, and I think we can all agree. I mean, was not God's intent that divorce happened. It wasn't God's intent that one person breaks up a marriage. But if for whatever reason that marriage is broken up, and it is going to be for one of the parties' reasons, there has to be an understanding or recognition that to repair, to redeem, or to get the family back together, there's going to be some suffering. There's going to be some short-term pain in order to get to the other side. And to your point, we don't want to deal with the pain, or we take that pain to mean that either God is punishing us or that we are not aligned with what we're supposed to do. And so then you switch up doing it because what God is asking you to do hurts. But to some degree, if it hurts, that may be God asking you to do it, because that's not the situation that you necessarily would have for yourself. But even in all that, there has to be a recognition that, hey, to get to where I want to be, it's gonna hurt. You look at David. David was a fugitive. David was being chased after for the point of killing. And while God told him, "You're going to be a ruler over my people." But again, that pain, that suffering they had to do. I mean, he was at various points saying, "God, I don't want to do this anymore. If this is what it takes for me to get here, I don't want it." And I imagine a lot of us say that, even Jesus, "Hey, if this is what it takes to get here, I'm not sure I want to do this." But then you accept that, but hey, this is what you're asking me to do. I can only overcome if I'm walking in the direction that you're asking me to walk. So I'm going to remove, as you talked about, humble myself. I'm going to deny myself this present satisfaction in order to make sure the long term, or where you're asking me to be on the other side, I get there.
Yeah. I think when, as you said, the only way that you can, well, not the only way that you can, but the way that we probably should accept that is with Thanksgiving. And so this week we'll celebrate Thanksgiving. So I hope that each one of us, I know it's a difficult time of the year for many people because they're dealing again still with hurt, they're dealing with loss and everything. But if we can somehow, even in this season, give thanks in the midst of our suffering, then I do believe and see that this is somehow or another the path of God for you. It's not an evil path, but God does have a plan to bring you to an expected end. And he knew that you're going to go through these steps, through this period of grief, through this period of mourning, through this period of suffering and hurt or illness, whatever it is. He knew that you were going to go through that. It didn't catch him by surprise. And perhaps all he's waiting for you to do is to still give him thanks, even in all of this. And so happy Thanksgiving to you this week.
I'll take it for the rest of this month on Saturdays. That's what we will make sure to give some thanks.
I do want to, and sometime here in the coming weeks, we do want to have somebody on, a counselor on to talk about grief, because grief is a necessary human experience, and we want to know how to be able to do that and still even give thanks even when we're grieving.
Yeah, so we are going to work on that. If you have any questions or topics that you would like us to discuss with the person that we bring on, please comment and let us know so we can make sure to get that out there when we have our professional on to talk about grief. So, well, that concludes our conversation today on prayer and Thanksgiving. Like I said, I'm sure we'll make sure to give thanks each day, each Saturday we do this. So I will also sorry because you thanked me for being the wonderful cousin
Sure. We'll go with
and
that.
person that I am, and you know, I want to thank you for that compliment. And so, but no, seriously, I mean, I thank you guys for this platform. I think, you know, us for being able to talk about not only various things in our Christian world, but also just in our professional world, things to be able to do this and to give this and share this information with you guys as listeners. We are completely in awe of gratitude and thankful for that. And so please continue to comment, like, share. Please continue to be here every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern time to
Even when we're
discuss with
not,
us.
huh?
Yes, you are not. Check out some of the old episodes. They're all there. Make sure you're following us on your favorite podcast platform. Also catch us on YouTube. And finally, catch us on Star Radio for a repeat of this episode. Until next Saturday, thank you guys so much for tuning in.